right, welcome to what we assume will be episode 2 or 3 of Radio Squid Jigger. We're going to cobble this together after we do this one. Most people aren't going to give a rip about how we got here. So let's not talk about that and move on. I was saying to, well, my name is Thad. On the other side of this phone is Josh. Josh?
Good evening.
There we go. I was saying in an email to Josh that we are sort of reproducing, almost 75 years of U.S. foreign policy, because we started this off saying we're not just going to talk about the Middle East. And then the Middle East goes on and is so god-awful screwed up, it's so fast that that's all you wind up talking about. So it's just, like we're just doing the same thing everyone else does. Like, oh, the world's really messed up place, but boy, the really messed up place is right over there. So just in the past couple days, there's not a whole lot that I think usually can surprise either of us all that much about international politics, international affairs, but kind of out of the blue, the Saudis, the Egyptians, and the Emiratis, the Abu Dhabi and Dubai, broke diplomatic relations and all travel with Qatar on, I think it was Monday their time, so Sunday Western time. And I think both of us were a little bit surprised by that, correct?
I had no idea. I knew recently them.
I'm sorry, so you're cutting out a bit. Say once more.
That there was a problem with them posting something kind of pro-Iranian that it turns out perhaps might have been a hack and not actually them.
Yeah.
But that seemed, I kind of assumed that, there maybe a diplomat would be sent home or something like that. Which
has always kind of been the traditional reaction in that part of the world, is if you're pissed off at somebody, then you call your ambassador back, and then, 6 weeks or 3 months later, you quietly send him back to his old job. So you sort of like register your displeasure and then get on with life. But this seems like a bit more serious than that. And also, as we said, sort of unexpected.
And it's kind of unprecedented. I can't really think of a similar situation in that area, in that region outside of, Israel or like the oil embargo or something.
Right, or like starting a war.
Like that, of like economic embargo is kind of, that kind of, usually, as you say, something associated with a full-on war.
Right, as opposed to, and also it's worth remembering too that with travel restrictions, most of the Gulf states have airlines that are pretty important to their sort of both national prestige and their profits. So Qatar Airways is a huge airline. Emirates is the airline that runs out of Abu Dhabi. And they've also denied that airline the right to fly both in their airspace and to land at their airports. So it's sort of like United has suddenly been told that they can't fly into O'Hare. It's pretty bad news for the country. Now, one of the things that we talked about offline a little bit as well was if you look at the geography, it's not that hard to figure out why Qatar would be more sympathetic to Iran than a lot of the other parts of the Gulf, because Qatar's entire hydrocarbon economy is based on a natural gas field that it literally shares with Iran. They're punching holes into the exact same tin can filled with natural gas that goes back to Iran. So it's not surprising that they're a little bit more friendly, but again, previous to this, everyone could sort of get along reasonably well. So one of the theories is that basically the Qataris were given a pass by Donald Trump, or the Saudis were given a pass, do whatever the hell they wanted with the Qataris while he was there. So what do you think? Does that make any sense to you? I mean, it sort of makes sense.
The only reason is the timing seems kind of, whether it was something that was acquiesced to verbally, like they brought it up, said, now, is that okay with you?
Right.
Was that, or just possibly the fact that we just penned a $110 billion arms deal with you, and you actually, for one, didn't even say anything stupid the entire time. You must really like us. I don't know if they thought it. I don't know if they thought that, like a tacit agreement, that it's okay. Because, America has a big with this situation. In our largest airbase command center logistical node in the entire region is located in Qatar.
Right.
So,
real quickly, Josh, you're also still cutting out a little bit. Can you get a little bit like near a tower or something? Or, I don't know, or move around your room?
I'm hearing it on your end, too. I can't.
Huh.
I'll try and just sit closer to a window.
Okay, and then if it doesn't work,
Hopefully that helps.
I will call you again. But nevertheless, that is a very good point as well, which is the Seventh Fleet is anchored in Bahrain, correct?
Fifth, but yes.
I'm sorry, the fifth. Wrong fleet. See, there you go.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't nitpick, but yeah, there's a fleet there.
Yes, but whatever. There's a big fleet there. And I think you said the largest U.S. Air Force base in the region by a fair bit is in Qatar as well, correct?
Yes, it's called Al Udeid Air Force Base. It was basically when after the brouhaha with the Saudis kind of went bad because there was Obama, Osama bin Laden, and such. Everyone got really uncomfortable permanently basing Americans there on both sides of that deal.
Right.
And so Qatar was the fallback position. So CENTCOM is there. It's basically the size of, all of the New York airports put together into one complex. It's not simply an airbase. It's also a huge communications node. It's also where the Navy stores their planes for the area. It's a huge, just like fields and fields of just logistical equipment, like pre-positioned equipment, so that it can be deployed anywhere in the region by cargo aircraft.
Right.
And at any given moment, it has like on the order of like 100 heavy bombers, fuelers, and cargo planes sitting around. It's vast.
Right. Just wait. So if the U.S. has to go off and bomb the Punjab, that's where they would take off from.
Right.
Right. And that also means there are thousands, tens of thousands of U.S. military there, and then also contractors.
It would be tens of thousands.
Tens of thousands of Americans are there, and now they're in a beef with the Saudis. Which just, it sort of reminds me at the end of World War I. At one point, the British Foreign Office was arguing over the fact that they were paying different parts of the Middle East to murder each other. So it's like, can we just decide on one group that is actually going to be our? Because that's, the U.S. can't do anything about multiple tens of thousands of guys. They can't just up and leave, right? I mean, they can't move them somewhere else.
There's no place to move.
Right. There's no place else to go. So on the one hand, we're selling $100 billion at one stroke to one side of a conflict. It's not a conflict yet. To one side of a brutal diplomatic spat. On the other side, we have tens of thousands of Americans stationed at the most important airbase that we have in the region, all at the same time.
Yeah. I don't know exactly what like I said, I think the Saudis must have had some kind of sign-off to put the Americans in this position.
Some kind of quid pro quo, like that. They're right. Because somebody talked to somebody before this, and also the entire trip. The entire trip included nothing but speeches talking about how terrible Iran is, which is absolutely what the Saudis want to hear from everybody all the time. That Iran is the enemy of everybody else in the region, and as long as the U.S. agrees with that, then that gives them free hand to sort of do whatever they want. And as I said, Bahrain has a significant Shia minority. It's actually not. It's not a minority. The majority in Bahrain is Shia, ruled by a Sunni minority. And Oman has always had very good relationships with Iran for lots of historical and political and water rights issues. And so the U.S. has winds up on the opposite side, or essentially on both sides of this same conflict. And so, do you think it's something that just sort of stops again in a couple of months? People just forget about it and don't talk?
I don't see how the magnitude of the move to the Qataris, it just seems big enough. I think they blink and they back down. I don't really see how they can just, let this keep going.
Yeah. And
assume it's all going to be all right. And they're not really in a position to do much to stop it. Especially if we automatically assume that the U.S. in some way consented to this or said that it wasn't going to be a big deal if it happened, that leaves them pretty much without a sponsor.
True.
In front of an organized front. And I don't see them trying to go to Iran because that just kind of makes them formally on the other side of this whole thing. And I don't think they possibly want that either.
Right. So
here's a question for you. What is there a political arrangement in any way, shape, or form between Iran and Qatar over the gas field that they share?
Yeah, absolutely. It's literally the same gas field. So the Qataris and the Iranians have to agree on the order in which it gets developed. And actually, the Qataris every now and then have complained that the Iranians are developing parts of it too fast. So that in the long run, I don't know that much about how gas fields are exploited, but apparently you can do things that damage the long-term output of them. So there have to be. I mean, it's the same pocket of air. So there have been agreements about how to develop it over very long stretches of time, over decades. And the Qataris are also by far the largest investors in liquefied natural gas technology in the world. And also all of their hydrocarbons are natural gas. There's basically no oil that the Qataris have. So building the infrastructure to move natural gas outside of the Gulf as LNG, it's essentially a Qatari deal. So if the Iranians want to move significant amounts of LNG outside of their own gas fields, they pretty much either have to borrow the equipment or get permission from the Qataris to do that. So there are definite political and economic deals that have to be made, because it's like it's like they both own the same piece of farmland. Like everyone's cows have to use it. So you have to make a deal. So yeah, it's a really sticky situation, and it's one of those things where it came out so soon after our president was there that you have to assume something happened where somebody was told, okay, the leash is off. Have at it, kiddos.
The timing is too perfect.
Yeah. So that's just a little intro, actually. How long has this been going on? We've been going on, only about 15, 20 minutes. So that's something that happened in the past couple of days, and we'll be, I'm sure, picking up on that in the next few weeks. The other thing that we want to try to talk about tonight or today, depending on when you happen to be listening to this, is lots and lots of things have been happening very, very quickly in Syria, to the point where it's been, again, hard to keep up with what's going on. And we talked about this last time, but we both sort of think that the military end of this, the hardest part of the military end of the war against ISIS, not the whole war itself, but the war against ISIS, is something that should be counted on the order of months. Does that sound correct?
Yes, that's my guess.
So we're talking, before Thanksgiving.
I'm thinking so.
We expect there to be something very close to no piece of ISIS left.
To an ISIS that exists like only as an underground organization, like Al Qaeda always traditionally did.
Right, exactly. Or it exists on the internet. There are people who I mean, as we saw this past couple of days, ISIS will take credit for anything anybody will give them credit for. But as an actual functioning semi-state, semi-military force, we think that's going to be over relatively soon, right?
Yep.
Okay. And so, let's go over sort of why now, why in the past couple of months, why in the past couple of weeks, and how does that sort of play out inside the country, do you guess?
Well, I think there are two big people that are hitting them hard from different directions inside Syria. I think for the sake of simplicity, we'll just kind of skip over Iraq right now, but they're not doing well there either.
Right, true.
There's the Kurds moving on them from the north, and then also the Syrians moving also kind of from the other side of the Euphrates River from the north, and also from the Palmyra area, which they retook and have spread out very rapidly from. Exceptionally quickly, they've cleared out a lot of the area to the east of Damascus and the northeast of Damascus that was ISIS-controlled territory previously.
Right, and so what we're talking about in this case is essentially Syria regime with Russian air support. Yes,
Russian air support and Hezbollah and probably some Iranian actual field units as well.
Right, and those are I mean, what's the difference between a militia and a field unit? How do you break that down?
I would call like Hezbollah sufficiently armed and trained that I think we can call them pretty much an army in their own right.
Okay.
The Iranians obviously are an army in their own right, although the group that they send to fight abroad is usually the Al-Quds, I believe they called.
Right.
Which isn't part of the regular Iranian army.
Right.
But I don't know if there's really a U.S. equivalent of that.
Yeah, we saw like that exactly. Like, there's no like we don't have, like, the Germans don't have one of those.
Actually, the nearest equivalent would have been perhaps CIA units that operate outside the military command structure.
Oh, fair enough. That's actually a very good point. And there were a bunch of those in Afghanistan early on in that war as well, right after 9/11. When you think about it, and there were non-trivial numbers of people. It wasn't like there was a CIA guy with a backpack. There's
actual like fighting units, like organized. Actually, Vietnam would have been a good example too of them actually having almost their own like battalions of troops.
Right, and so the Kurds are coming from the north and going south, and they're actually right outside of Raqqa now, which we talked about before. And then there are essentially, pro-regime forces, sort of widely defined, and that would be all of the air power on that, we assume, would be Russians. And then on the very south of Syria, along the Jordanian border, there are also what would you call those groups? Those are they're local Syrian, kind of supported by the Jordanians, and they're also moving in the same direction, correct?
They're moving. They seem to be heavily supported by the U.S. and by Jordan, out of the town of Tanf.
Right.
Or Tanf, I guess it is. And they seem to get a lot of logistical support from the U.S. And at one point recently, when the regime forces actually tried to approach the area, they were actually attacked by U.S. aircraft after being warned off several times that they needed to head back home.
Right, actually blew them up, like blew up some pro-regime guys and killed them. And the word was it was like, technicals, pickup trucks with machine guns in the back and maybe a tank or two.
Tanks, even in any aircraft. They had some heavy equipment, and the first front of that convoy was taken out as kind of a warning shot, and then I think they got the message after that.
Right, like no, not here, guys. That's sort of what.
And the interesting thing is that apparently they were warned. There were armed flybys of U.S. aircraft. The Russians were called on the hotline that they have. And
really?
Like, hey, if your guys keep going. No, the Russians were informed. If you guys keep going, you better do something about this. I don't know if there was a breakdown in communications between the Russians and the Syrian Arab Army, which is the official army, or perhaps maybe there isn't a clear line of communications to Hezbollah and the Iranians, because it did seem to be kind of a militia Hezbollah group, not specifically the regular Syrian army. But they were warned with physical flyovers of U.S. aircraft, and the Russians were actually called.
Right.
They're saying, we're not going to if you keep going, we're not going to let this happen.
Right.
Which is the most interesting part of that episode, I thought, actually.
Right. Well, let's talk about that in a second, but you also sort of have to assume that the Russians were sort of like, hey, we told you guys. The Americans told us, we told you. If you want to go get your heads blown off, that's between you and your buddies. But actually, let's talk a little bit about that as well. So, and one of the surprising things about that whole scenario was not only did the United States military call the Russian military and say we're going to do this, they admitted in public in newspapers, oh yeah, we called the Russians.
Yeah.
Like
there was an open source. There wasn't like a leak or something I got on the DL. It was just a published fact.
Right. There was a military commander on the base who said, "Oh yeah, we called the Russians and told them not to do this."
Much in the same way that the Russians recently, there was a counter incident where the Russians were attacking something, and same thing. They publicly came out and said, "Yeah, we called the Americans before we did this."
Right. So and then also on that same sort of region, that same sort of question, how much bigger of a move is this for the U.S. to be actually in there logistically, and then also openly, admittedly, flying our own American planes? We're not arming somebody else. It's American pilots and American planes with American munitions that are actually that are dropping bombs on people. That hasn't happened before in a significant way that we were at least told about so far in this war, correct?
It happened, but only to ISIS, and so it was always okay.
Okay.
It was always kind of assumed that if anything that happens to ISIS is fine, and that the only thing that people are worried about is that their planes don't run into each other trying to bomb ISIS. It's pretty much the worry there.
Right. Don't turn left.
So ISIS was always a free fire zone, even for U.S. planes. But this is the first time I think that the U.S. has ever touched the regime outside of the cruise missile strike.
Right.
Which, again, the Russians were called and notified ahead of time.
Right.
That this is going to happen. If you have anybody near there, you want them pulled out. Kind of thing.
Get them out of there right away. Yes, and also to the credit of both sides of the military. Also, as far as we know, no accidents have happened. It's worked. The people who are talking to each other are getting each other's messages.
I mean, the interesting thing I've read is that since the cruise missile strike, that coordination, despite the fact the Russians said they were going to stop talking, coordination actually increased. As kind of, I think both sides wanting to, regardless of what both political leaders thought, want to make sure that in their own sandbox they were controlling, that they kept people from shooting at each other unless they're absolutely ordered to do so.
Yeah, which is, and it's a very sad thing for someone who, in the 90s was a crazy anti-American imperialist type to sit here and be like, well, hey, at least the militaries are acting like responsible parties.
They're the adults in the room.
Yeah, thank God someone has their head screwed on straight in this whole thing. It's the American and the Russian military. It's a sad day, but that's the way you have to feel. So then, so our guess is this is sort of, I think you actually said it. This is sort of like at the end of World War II at the Malta Conference when everyone knows the game is up relatively soon. So everyone's trying to basically position themselves the best possible way for what you assume will be some kind of negotiated peace. So if you take over a chunk of land, then you start negotiating from having had that chunk of land. So suddenly everyone's trying to haul ass over to where ISIS has been for the past couple of years, so they can lay stake to as much as possible when they start negotiating. Is that a good characterization?
I think so, definitely. I think people are definitely trying to carve up the map right now.
Carve up the end game.
Everyone's playing for the long term now. It's no longer surviving. It's now positioning yourself for the post-war.
Right. And so, and then if we're talking about what happens then, and this is something that we've talked about offline, and I think we do sort of want to actually highlight here is, for a couple of the parties in this in this thing, they would prefer it ended tomorrow and they could pack up and go home. A couple of parties can't go home because they're already home. It's where they live. And a couple of parties want, fairly different long-term kind of deals. So then you have to assume if someone doesn't get what they want, they can try to throw a whole wrench in the thing and start the unbelievably god-awful civil war over to begin with. So it's going to be a pretty delicate negotiation to make sure everyone has at least enough that they'll stop fighting. Does that make sense to you?
And I think it'll be a very thankless task from a couple directions.
Right. So let's talk a couple about those. Obviously, the people who wish they could go home the most are the Russians and the Americans.
Yeah, and I would even add the Iranians to that, and Hezbollah to some extent. Or maybe not home, but an end to fighting.
True, but I'm saying the Russians and Americans would just like to leave. They would prefer if they could just not ever be in Syria for the next 10 years. Correct?
Yeah.
Right.
Declare victory. The Russians can say they stabilized the regime. The Americans can say they wiped out. Trump can say he wiped out ISIS like he promised, and then parades.
Right. Exactly. Go home and tell everyone what a genius you are. And I think you're correct that the Iranians and Hezbollah want a long-term land bridge between themselves, which has been going through Syria for since Hezbollah came to exist in the early 1980s. So that's been going on forever. There's no question about that. So then the real wild cards are, I would say, the Syrian regime itself and then Turkey. And the Syrian regime has to be a wild card because my guess is the Russians would think that Assad being in charge of the country is a bargaining chip. And I don't think Assad thinks that him being in charge of the country is a bargaining chip. So that's one group, and the other group is the Kurds is the Turks, who have maintained a really significant military presence on their southern border, including a chunk that actually shares a border with Syria itself. So let's go over a little bit about that, of that history as well, and I'll let you start that for sure, because you know that much better than I do.
Well, the Turks, they at some point were even seemed pretty clear that they were even supporting ISIS. But that seems to have no longer be a thing. But the main groups that they always supported were the ethnic Turkish Syrians on the northern border.
Right.
And they've actually manufactured kind of a proxy army of them to the point of actually pulling some of them off one side of the border on the far side of the Kurdish Afrin canton, and then arming them and then inserting them back on the other side of it into an area that they now kind of control that stretches from the Turkish border down to Al-Bab, intentionally to break the Turkish territory into two pieces that are non-continuous.
Right.
Then they're generally referred to as the Turkmen brigades, and they actually do have some Turkish personnel attached to them.
Okay,
as well.
They're actually Turkish personnel. They're guys in Turkish army uniforms.
The Turkish floppy hats, for lack of a better word, really.
the Turkish floppy fezzes.
Yeah.
Is that too racist to say? Can I say floppy fezzes? We
can probably get away with that.
We may have to edit that out. But so the Turkish floppy fezzes are in that part. So again, like they could actually the Turks could have actual dead guys coming home. They
already have.
Right.
That has definitely happened already. They don't publicize it, and with the referendum and the crackdown in Turkey, it's kind of easy to sweep under the rug.
Right.
But they've definitely already taken casualties of their own personnel on top of the people that they're supporting there.
Right. So this is on an arc that is basically the if you're looking at a map, the border between Turkey and Syria on the far side, the Mediterranean side, is I can't even remember the name. Starts with an L. Latakia.
Idlib.
Yes. Well, yes. I'm talking about the actual Mediterranean coast where the Assads are.
Latakia?
Yes, Latakia. That's the actual sort of Alawite section of the country. And then next to that, there's another chunk that shares an actual physical border with Turkey. And then there's a small Kurdish area. Then there's another small chunk that you're talking about now where they've been pushing south and sort of splitting the Kurdish areas into pieces. And then a big Kurdish region that goes on to the west towards Iraq. So again, then the next question becomes, if that's how they're trying to sort of, and clearly that's a great way to be able to throw a wrench into any negotiation that you want to, right? Because you've two different places. You could in theory start 4 different fronts if you wanted to just throw down and raise hell. Correct?
Yeah, that would be a big commitment by them.
Yes.
I think it's also worth noting that the area that the Turkmen brigades operate in between the two Kurdish areas is pretty much stagnant because the Americans moved in one area on the eastern side to support the Kurds, and the Russians actively moved up on the western side. So both those powers have basically said that you're not going to, the goal was to separate and conquer the Kurds. But after reaching Al-Bab, they pretty much are in a holding pattern. They're no longer really attacking the Kurds. They're also not attacking the Syrian regime forces. So they're kind of just, outside of some skirmishing and some mortar fire, they're kind of just holding on to land as pretty much that's their Malta piece. That's their thing they can negotiate with. Right. And it keeps the Kurds separated unless somebody wants to actually fight them for it. But right now, they're kind of in a static holding pattern.
Right, and it also seems as if not a whole lot has been moving in the other region along the border. So this entire situation, you have to think, couldn't have come out too much worse for the Turkish regime that's in power now. What they really wanted was to be rid of Assad because he was a rival, and to do whatever they could to squash down Kurdish independence within their own country. So, like, if you were to put two simple global high-level goals of the Syrian civil war, that would have been what Turkey would have wanted. And it looks like they're going to get, A, neither of those things, and B, they could have some genuine problems with their own domestic politics because there are going to be a lot of very, very upset Syrians who have been fighting for them, who are not going to take kindly to being sold down the river if that's what they think is going to happen to them in some sort of negotiation. So, like what could have gone worse for Turkey in this whole situation?
I really cannot imagine. They managed to back themselves into a corner with both Russia and the U.S.,
which is really hard to do right now.
They tried to back themselves back into Russia's good graces, and then learn really quickly that I think they tried to go back to Putin and be like, okay, we'll help you out and we'll help stabilize Syria. Once it became clear that Assad was not going to militarily fall, after all, maybe like shortly after the shoot down, it seemed pretty clear that the Russians actually had staunched, the flow of the rebels. And they pissed off Obama horribly, and then they thought Trump coming back in was their second chance with the United States. And just all of it, he just almost as much as ISIS, you seem to make choices that just pissed off everybody and backed him into a corner. I can't picture a worse failure for his foreign policy than pretty much where we're at right now.
Yeah, and again, from a negotiating standpoint, the concern there is, once somebody has nothing to lose, then they really have nothing to lose. Hey, it can't get any worse if I start this thing up again. I don't think that's going to happen, but it really is it was no small task to manage to screw this up that bad. That's some A-level screw up there. You don't do that like in first grade. You got to train to get things that poorly. And then the next big question to me at least is what happens with Assad? If you one of the things I think a lot of people forget about this war is at the very, very, very beginning of the war, way back 6 years ago, when the Arab Spring was supposedly breaking out in Syria, Assad had the Assads, so Bashar and his father Hafez have been brutally jailing Muslim fundamentalists since way before it was cool. They've been doing it forever. And when the civil war broke out, Assad emptied the prisons of all of the crazy, lunatic, fundamentalist, jihadi Syrians that he could in order to help foment this war, because he wanted to present the war as a choice between me and those crazies, which he has done. I mean, in a brutal realpolitik sense, ISIS was the best thing that could have happened to Assad, because like whatever you might think about him, ISIS is worse. So he managed to get, again, in a horrible, terrible, treacherous way, sort of what he wanted, which was you get me or you get the crazies. And now... Yeah. And I
feel like he almost, like, the police were showing up and he lit a fire in his own house so that everyone would have something else to do.
Yes, I think it's exactly what he did, and again, in a very cruel, brutal way, it has kind of worked. So then the question becomes: is the U.S. actually going to push back that hard to get rid of Assad? And then, if they do, will the Russians care enough to do anything about that? Is there anything strategically important enough in basically destroyed, brutalized Syria that there's a Russian foreign policy piece for this? I mean, they share some water borders and that sort of thing, but is there a real strategic reason beyond that the Russians would have to keep a friendly regime in Syria, or they have to keep Assad specifically in Syria?
Not he as an individual, but I believe, I'm willing to bet that they've been promised by him or people under him that they get to keep their base in Tartus indefinitely, and they're already building a lot more stuff there now.
Oh, they are.
And it represents this is already happening now. It used to be that was just pretty much a barracks and a pier, and it was pretty much just a load on, load off point, like a private dock.
Okay.
They've been given a lot more of the area and are building more there, and it's pretty clear that they want to stay in the Mediterranean and have some kind of say there. and they always have the traditional warm water port problem and getting their ships out of the Black Sea, or sending, in the case of their aircraft carrier, comically sending it all the way down from the North Fleet, like all the way around England, all the way around Spain, like through the Mediterranean, like that carrier must have used up like all of its like remaining life doing that sortie in and out just so it could launch like a dozen aircraft and then beach them afterwards.
Right.
So I think they very much want that port now, especially with how much they feel accomplished, they feel they're a world power, and I'm pretty sure that whoever takes over in Syria, whether it's Assad or someone else in the current regime, that's going to be non-negotiable for them.
Okay, and I actually did not know that they've been building that up, and also just so for people who are listening, where is the port you're talking about? It's Black Sea, but
the port on the Mediterranean in Latakia on the coast.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was thinking.
So
Black
in the government controlled in what is still friendly to the regime area. And also that's basically the main offload point for Russian equipment. Anything that's not flown in gets shipped in from the Black Sea and offloaded there.
Okay.
So it very much is important to them because it is outside the Black Sea, and it's their only base pretty much outside of the Russian territory. Pretty much, I don't think they have any other significant naval base besides that. So I don't see them putting that down.
Are there submarines there?
I have not heard reports of that.
Okay.
There are very few submarines based in the Black Sea. Probably only a little over a half dozen diesel electrics.
Okay.
No nuclear ones to speak of.
Okay.
But they certainly could in the future.
Right.
I suspect right now submarines aren't a priority just because they're generally busy actually bringing in cargo ships and such.
Right.
But I suspect the long-term strategic goal would be to keep the airbase that they're operating from as a Russian airbase and keep the port that they're offloading from as a Russian naval base and have a permanent Mediterranean presence.
Right. And then again, that wouldn't make the Assads themselves necessary, but that would make a friendly,
it would make part
a
of
long
the
term
current regime necessary that they made the agreement with. But
Right.
It wouldn't have to be Assad. I think if they somehow got to have what they want and the whole war wound down and they could say we won, and that they kept the government intact, not necessarily Hafez Assad
Right.
intact, or Bashir, I should say, his son. As if he were somehow removed and went to go on a vacation in the south of Russia or something like that, or some other safe exile place, as far as they're concerned, that's still a win. I don't think they particularly care about him as an individual.
Right.
As long as they get what they want. Like, they basically want the end of the war, and they want a permanent base presence there, I think.
Right. Now, another question as well. There, a lot of times the way that the Assad regime is talked about is that it's 100% Alawite, that it's 100% sort of splinter Shia, and that's not actually all that accurate. There is the Assad family has actually married some very prominent Sunni families in the country, and there's also a huge number of very, very successful Sunni politicians and Sunni businessmen who made a deal and made peace and did business with the Assad regime going back to when Papa Hafez was in charge. So it's not like it would have to be an Alawite or would have to be Bashar al-Assad's cousin or uncle or son or something like that in charge. Again, from the perspective of the Russians. But you do have to wonder, again, if Bashar al-Assad was willing to throw his entire country on the fire in order to keep his regime alive, would he do the same thing again?
I've never met him before, personally. He is on the record as saying that he will reconquer that entire country. Everything I've ever heard about him, since even in the darkest days, just before the Russians came in, he always just seemed oddly, completely confident, or at least in any kind of interview or any public speech, completely confident that this was a temporary situation that he was going to overcome. And it was never clear to me if that was just him putting his best face on it because anything less would lose the country, or if he actually, was somewhat delusional in thinking that this is that somehow Syria is going to be the same after this under his control.
Yeah.
which seems very much not the case. I mean, if nothing else, it seems like his allies are all going to have a piece of it, and it seems pretty obvious that the northern Kurds are not going to be completely subdued either. I can't really get a gauge for what he considers realistic and what he doesn't. But
Right.
I feel that because everyone else wants the war to end, and he is still very much dependent on the Russians, not only for their air support, but also for their equipment and their training, especially. And I think it's important to note that the reason that things are turning around now is because of a lot of fresh Russian heavy equipment and a lot of extensive training by the
Right.
Russians in things like mine clearing, and specializations that were not previously the fortes of the Syrian army even before the war.
Right.
And that without Russian support, this would not be a thing without Russian equipment and training.
Right.
I don't think he really is in a position to tell anyone that the war will keep going if the Iranians and the Russians agree that the war is going to stop. I don't think he really can say that because I don't think he would have enough units loyal to him himself that could pull that off.
Right. Right.
So,
Actually,
I think he's used up. I think no matter how radical he is, he'd have a hard time keeping the war going if everyone else could somehow be brought to some agreement.
could somehow
Which is
make
a big
deal.
if.
Right. I see. I'm also dealing with with the bane of suburban existence, which is these aren't even my dogs, but there's a lawnmower and a dog.
Well, when
All right, there
the
we go.
lawnmower is done, the other people I think we need to circle back onto is the Kurds
Right. Good point.
for a moment.
Let me seriously give this just a second. Come on.
Are you getting any reverb from me during this whole thing? I've been hearing a little feedback.
There could be a little bit from my headphones, but it doesn't seem to be too obvious on the recording.
As long as you're not really getting on your side, it doesn't really matter if I hear it.
No, it's fine. I've actually these headphones are actually even tighter on my ears than the last ones. Okay. They turned off the lawnmower.
Okay.
Yay. Okay.
So the other 600-pound gorilla is the Kurds are, especially due to heavy U.S. involvement, just over the last year, have really just gone from making a last stand at Kobani to one of the largest, best organized, best equipped movements in the entire country.
Absolutely, and that's something that we haven't been talking about up to now, and we probably should have been. They have carved out, when you think about it, probably the strongest position that is both political and military of anybody who's going to sit down at those negotiating tables, because A, they're there, like it's their home territory, and B, they have a completely legitimate right to say, we have fought as long and as hard and suffered as much to get to where we are now as anybody else in this entire engagement. Correct?
And not only that, they enjoy in the one piece and to the west, they seem to have the support of the Russians to the point of the Russians actually driving their own troops there. And in the Kobani canton to the east, have American Rangers backing them up to ensure that nobody bombs them, and huge amount of American aid. And
Right.
I think it's also notable, you talked about strategic positions. Not only do they cover a huge amount of area that is largely their own area and ethnically, but also they're in control of 3 of Syria's dams at the top and bottom of Lake Assad, and another one just between Tabqa and Raqqa as well.
Right.
Which not only control a huge amount of the water that's used for agriculture across the Euphrates River Valley, but also generates a I think almost double-digit percentage of the total electricity of the country.
Electricity in the country.
So
Yeah. Yes.
So
Yes.
again going back to Turkey really having screwed the pooch and being in the absolute worst position they could have thought of, they now just partially because of this war that they helped ferment and go with, they have created the most powerful Kurdish group they could have possibly ever imagined.
Far more powerful than any Kurdish group in the past, 50, 100 years at least. They're
At least. I mean, Iraqi Kurdistan is nothing compared to what the YPG has now managed to accomplish. And
Right.
they've also gone to great. I mean, you tell me all the time about the getting good publicity. You told me about a couple of things that happened. Christian unit.
There are one of the things.
Snipers.
Yes. One of the things that they've actually been pushing in the press recently is there are now Assyrian Christian militias in that same northern part of the country who are coordinating, and they're very, very small. We're talking about 100 to a few hundred people. But again, they're some of the oldest Christian churches in the world are actually in Syria. And so they basically have like little mini YPGs that have been set up as Christian organizations that also have women in them, because the YPG does love their women fighters. And you haven't seen huge numbers of stories about it yet, but the Kurds are even going out of their way to mention to the West that there are now Christians on their side of this fight as well, as if they haven't been doing a good enough job already with their press releases. They're also projecting that out onto the Western sort of narrative about who they're protecting in this war. So they're protecting Yazidis, they're protecting Assyrian Christians, they're protecting themselves. So they've done a fantastic job at the propaganda. That's an unfair term that makes it sound like Joseph Goebbels or something. They're doing a fantastic job of capturing the narrative, right? Something like that. In this whole situation.
The umbrella group, the Syrian diplomatic forces, always included some Arabs as well. So it's kind of started. I mean, and again, in token amounts, we're primarily talking the YPG proper, but they've done a great job integrating anybody who wants to come under that umbrella and just kind of making it look like a very multicultural, open-minded. Which, I mean, quite honestly, compared to any other organization in the country, they are.
Yes, exactly. If there's such a thing as a bunch of Syrian hippies, it's them. And they're not at all, but by Syrian standards, I think they're the flower children of
the bar is low. The bar is low.
That's right. So again, that's a group that you don't think would be. That's a group who basically just wants what they think they're owed, and I don't see them as a group that would try to throw the negotiations onto the fire just because they're not getting some little small piece of this or that if they want. If they get, I think, a basic level of autonomy, a basic level of federalism, and a certain degree of self-determination, and they can have schools that teach in Kurdish and that sort of thing, I don't see them as burning this whole thing down. But that is certainly a massive improvement. And as you say, that may be another thing that actually annoys the regime, about having to give up that kind of control over a big chunk of the country. So that will be another point of conflict between the people who are actually both on the winning side when you think about it.
I think the regime, they've already made enough agreements with the Kurds that they seem to be, it seems like there's already some underlying agreement going on. And if nothing else, the Russians clearly are pro-Kurd.
Right, exactly.
And the Russians are also clearly anti doing anything that involves shooting at Americans.
Yes.
So I actually think when it comes to the regime and the Kurds, we have two sides, and also the Kurds are sitting on a lot of really, really important natural resources that the regime is going to need to integrate with at some point.
Right, like water and electricity. Like that's
right.
That's pretty important in that part of the world.
The one thing that the Kurd situation could cause to be a horrible problem is back again with the Turks, in that they have now created practically, what by Kurdish standards is like a Kurdish superpower. Right. I mean, like the most successful Kurdish area in, as you say, only probably 100 years, and the proxies that Turkey uses are nowhere near strong enough to do anything about that. But the Turkish army would be if they wanted to go full crazy and wanted to call the American bluff of the Rangers on the Turkish border,
right?
And they wanted to establish some kind of buffer zone. That's the one way. That's one of the biggest ways. Not very likely, but the biggest way I could see things going completely off the rails is if Turkey just does not accept a semi-autonomous Kurdish area right on their border.
It just rolls in APCs and tanks and starts going at it.
And just the Turkish army is big enough they could do something about it. And the Americans actually would have a hard time militarily stopping them from doing that. right at the border anyway. But I mean, once you shoot at American soldiers, things go crazy really quickly. So I don't see that happening. But Recep Erdogan is just not always reacting kind of really in a very logical manner. Sometimes it seems
super rationally. Yeah.
He had his bodyguards beat up some protesters in the United States, and then sent a diplomatic cable protesting the fact that they were actually disarmed briefly and then released.
Yes,
which is some huge brass balls if you think about it.
Yes, it is. But what we have been talking about here is not necessarily like the likely outcomes. The likely outcome, if everyone has their head screwed on more or less straight, is a brokered end to one of the most vicious, brutal, nihilistic, terrifying wars that we're ever going to see in our entire life. That's what makes sense. So what we're talking about is what could happen, even though it doesn't make sense. And I think you're absolutely right that rolling tanks across the border and saying there shall not be a Kurdistan, you must move a mountain before you move me, is one of those. It's not impossible. That seems crazy and
that's
stupid.
That's the nightmare scenario for me. That's the there's no other power in the region that really could screw this up super horribly. There are some various sects of the Free Syrian Army that I think will end up fighting for a lot longer, particularly if the Gulf Cooperation Council continues to support them. And this would be all the crazy that you and I have discussed offline about Idlib and every pocket of various jishis that gets defeated and surrenders gets shipped out to that same region again and again and again.
Right.
Like concentrating the crazy in the area that's also again right south of Turkey, but on the other side of everybody else, going up to the edge of the Mediterranean.
Right.
But still north of the government areas.
Yep.
That's the area that I think realistically won't necessarily sign a peace agreement super easily, and actually will try and do something about it. But they're also not nearly strong enough to really do much more than fight on their immediate borders.
Right.
So the Turkish army would be the absolute nightmare scenario. This war is going to keep going for a long time, kind of thing.
Right.
Again, not likely. Just the worst possible thing.
You could also certainly see the fezzes and floppy hats going into the Idlib region and stirring up trouble as a piece of a bargaining chip. Now that's a very, very dangerous move. That
I think is almost certainly going to happen, because I feel like the Turks have lost so much faith that wherever they can draw a line in the sand reasonably without getting into a full-blown war with Russia or the U.S., I think they're going to try and do it, because this entire thing looks so bad at home to anyone who's really paying attention and is against the Kurds, which is a fair bit of his actual voting base.
Yeah.
That this looks like a pretty bad situation, especially once if you actually get into a negotiation and it becomes. Right now, I think some people are in denial that there's going to be a semi-autonomous Kurd area on their border.
Right.
I think that's inevitable unless Turkey actually rolls in tanks. And I think as we get to the actual endgame negotiations, we're going to see some weird Turkish politics and some pretty weird Turkish foreign policy.
Yeah, I'm actually disconcerted and unhappy to hear you say, "Oh yeah, they're certainly going to do that," because I don't know, call me a softie, but I think these people have suffered enough. But you're probably being far more realistic than I am. But they're going to stoke that fire to try to get a few extra concessions against this guy or that guy, and you're probably right about that. And that also means that also will probably certainly extend the conflict by a matter of, you'd have to say, at least months. Correct?
Yeah, I don't think it'll. I think there might be separate pieces, because that's generally been the regime strategy to date, is to basically the Turkmen brigades and the regime forces basically stopped fighting each other, and the Turkish supported forces were just allowed to take Al-Bab. And they just kind of signed off like, okay, you go ahead and do this, and we won't stop you.
Right.
You get to have this chunk of ISIS. We'll go hurt somebody else. And as long as you don't cross this red line, we're good. And they pretty clearly have made agreements with the Kurds because the Russians are actively even blocking for the Kurds in some regions.
Right.
Primarily because the Russians, I think, hate the Turks.
Right.
And so I think what you'll see is separate pieces made. And the Kurds, I think, would be in the best position to just be like, hey, we're fine, and we'll even turn over some area back to you. That's great, as long as, we have our own deal. And that basically, every time he makes a separate peace, he frees up more of his army to focus on whoever doesn't make a peace and put them in a worse position.
Right.
And I think it'll ultimately come down to just Idlib by itself, that province.
And that's going to be ugly. You don't want to get a hotel room in Idlib anytime soon. That is
no, and that's exactly why I think we're close to the end game for a lot of the country, but I think that one region, partially because of the Turks and partially because that's generally where all these worst, most crazy groups that aren't already ISIS have been moved to every time they lose ground.
Right.
That last pocket, I think, is going to be so I said there was going to be truces and negotiations by fall. I think that will happen for some parts of the country, but I think that last piece will keep going on into next year in that province. I don't think, number one, there's nobody who actually completely runs that as a unified group. Yep. There are a lot of Islamic groups there that occasionally will shoot each other for practically no reason. I think I told you once before that it's the actual real life incarnation of the People's Front of Judea versus the Judean People's Front.
Yes.
Everyone there has a chip on their shoulder and thinks they're jihadier than thou, and they just will not, they won't even get along together, let alone cut any deal with the regime.
Right.
And then they're largely supported by, actually circling back to our other discussion, they're supported by people like the Qataris and also the Saudis.
Largely,
and there could be Turkish involvement once the Turks realize that they're about to lose in every possible way, shape, and form.
So that's where, unfortunately, we suspect the largest set of problems are going to be, and the largest set of conflicts that could derail deals with other groups in the country are likely to continue. So just don't go there. Don't book a ticket to Idlib. Which is, and again,
it's going to take a while for the housing market to bounce back. Yeah.
Yes, and that sounds cruel, and we shouldn't be joking about that. But I joke about things that are too terrible for me to take seriously, so that's why I joke about them. But yeah, that seems to be.
And I'm just an asshole.
And Joss is just an asshole. But yeah, that definitely seems to be the way that this is most likely to wind down. All right, so just so we're on the record here on the prediction front, and then we're a little bit past an hour here, so we can probably close this up. On the prediction front, we're saying, say 3 to 4 months, most of the military action outside of that one region in the sort of northeast of the country is likely to be over or close to over. And then we assume there's going to be, or we're guessing there's going to be some kind of negotiated, not necessarily a peace, but a negotiated, we'll stop shooting each other, for big chunks of the country outside of that same region, and probably a fairly independent, federalized Kurdish region. And that is unless someone goes completely batshit crazy between now and then. Is that a fair summary?
I think that's the only other thing I'd add in is that I suspect there will be a tiny region on the Jordanian border that effectively becomes kind of a Jordanian security zone of Syrian proxies, because we're already seeing that happen, and the Jordanians are not about to allow Hezbollah or the Iranians to be right on their border.
To set up camp forever, yeah. Okay.
But I suspect that'll be kind of an easier thing to broker, because it'll be basically without the U.S. and Jordan, that group doesn't really exist. It barely exists now.
Right.
As we used to call them after the failed new Syrian army, I think we now like to call these guys the new Syrian army.
Right.
So I think that there'll be a sliver on the Jordanian border that's kind of a proxy-controlled buffer zone. I think the Kurds are going to get their own area. I think ISIS will largely have ceased to exist and will be either regime-controlled or Kurdish-owned. And then all the other Free Syrian Army pockets, I think, will be rolled up by the end of the year. And there'll be some kind of peace made with the Jordanian edge and the Kurds. And then I don't know what really happens in Idlib. And I also don't really know what happens to the area of the Turkish brigade, the Turkmen brigades that are between the two Kurdish areas.
Right.
Because they have Turkish support, I don't think the regime can possibly dislodge them. But it's not clear to me what Turkey's going to do with them. It'd be hard to. They're not really religious. It'd be hard to just cut them off. So, those are the wild cards. Is the region up north of Al Bab and the region at Idlib. Those places I think will not necessarily have a peace by the end of the year, but I suspect most of the rest of the country will.
Right. And then one last question, and then we will close this up. You have to assume that if you and I, sitting here in the United States with nothing but computers and time on our hands, can get, I think, a fairly cohesive, reasonable picture of how this ends. That the people who are actually there have a much better idea than we do. So, if you are somebody who's in central Syria, whether you were in Raqqa or you're somewhere further down the river towards Iraq or something like that, and you're trying to get out. And I would assume if you were in charge of a group, you would say, all right, everyone do your best to melt off into the populace and then, go take your revenge at the, what did Rumsfeld say? The time and place of your choosing. So, isn't that what you would do strategically? Like if you were in charge, you would say, okay, put your weapons down and melt away. Do you think that's something that happens? Like, are we going to be hearing in 5 years about, guys who were in that, that valley of the Euphrates and were, running away when the Russians and the Kurds and the Americans showed up, who then go and do other horrible things? Are they going to show up in the Philippines as experienced, battle-hardened troops or something like that? What do you see happening there?
I mean, ISIS definitely isn't going to go away. It might lose all its territory, but it will at least underground continue to exist. As for the various Jaishes that have popped up, and in particular the what used to be the Al-Nusra Front, and now I think it's now called the HTC.
Yeah.
I think that you will definitely see some of that, but to some extent, I think some of these groups and people are regional, and I don't see them. I see a lot of them maybe being fundamentalist Islamicists, but I don't see them necessarily leaving Syria for it, unless they actually feel threatened for their lives, which is very possible, in which case you might see them at terrorist training camps in Afghanistan or what have you. So I think there'll be some hit or miss. I don't see them all arriving as a organized force somewhere or popping up as an organized force. But I mean, we've seen what happened after the Mujahideen in Afghanistan broke. After that band broke up. Eventually, there are elements of that both started up a fight there later and also spread to other regions to do training.
Yeah,
as far away as Somalia. For the entire episode of Black Hawk Down actually involved an element of Mujahideen that were retasked by Al Qaeda for that.
Right.
So there's definitely going to be some of that. There are too many hardcore, well-trained people for that not to happen to some degree. As to how much, I think it's almost, it's just impossible to say.
Right. The other classic example of that is Chechens. Is you always like if there's a crazy Islamist insurgency somewhere, at some point you're going to hear about some Chechens, to the point where you'll sometimes hear about them in Indonesia. And believe me, I've flown from Indonesia to not too far from Chechnya, and it's a long haul. So those groups do show up, here and there. Again, usually in small numbers, but I do have to wonder with the amount of time that the people who call themselves, sort of core ISIS have had to train, to work with each other, to get to know each other, as well. So that means that when somebody calls, you know who they are. that it may be that we may be hearing about some of these people in other places in the world for a couple of years at least. Would not surprise me a bit. Unfortunate but true.
No, ISIS absolutely is a single broad-ranging movement, definitely organized, and had a huge amount of money and a huge amount of contacts at their height. I think the other Syrian groups a little less so, and so you'll see them be like the foot soldiers somewhere. But I believe ISIS. It'll hardly be the end of ISIS.
Right. Right.
It'll just make them a group that operates truly as a traditional terrorist group.
Right. And not so much.
But they're too organized, and they had their hands in too many cookie jars for them to not be an organized, group that actually exists still. Actually still has a hierarchy and at least people who know each other loosely, if not an Al Qaeda level of organization.
Right. Right. Well, and it's something else that we should do, and maybe we'll break it off here. We should talk sometime relatively soon about what's been happening for the past two bombings in England, because you had some very scary theories about how those people might have learned how to make the bombs that they did when they were in Manchester. So why don't we leave that until the next episode, and close this one off, and talk again in about a week.
Okay, sounds good.
That sound good to you?
Uh-huh.
All right. Very good, Josh. We will talk to you in about a week from now at Radio Squid Jigger, either, I don't know, 3 or 4, something like that. We'll figure it out.
We'll number them later.
Yes, exactly. All right. Thank you very much. We'll talk then.
All right. Stay off the hook.